I still remember the sound before I remember the silence. 6 sharp little snaps carried across the harbor in the middle of the night, a noise I slept right through. And by sunrise, those 6 cuts had already changed the course of my life. When I stepped onto Dock 8 that morning, coffee still warm in my hand, and gulls screaming overhead like nothing in the world had happened, I knew something was wrong before I even reached my boat. My floats were gone, every single one of them. The bright orange markers my dad and I had painted together for years had disappeared into the gray Atlantic, and the lines leading down to my crab pots had been sliced so clean it looked like somebody had measured each cut with a ruler instead of a knife. I stood there for a second, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe a propeller, maybe a storm current, maybe some freak accident. But storms don't leave razor-straight cuts. People do. My name's Ethan Calloway. I'm 39 years old, born and raised in Stone Mill Harbor on the coast of Maine. And until last year, my entire world fit inside a 24-foot workboat called the Hazel May. She wasn't pretty. Her paint had faded from blue to something between gray and salt. Her engine coughed every cold morning before settling into its familiar rumble. And every inch of her smelled like diesel fuel, wet rope, old baits, and decades of honest work. To somebody sailing in on $1 million yacht, she probably looked like scrap waiting for the junkyard. But to me, she was home. My father had bought that boat after coming back from the Gulf War with a damaged knee, a government loan, and absolutely no interest in sitting behind a desk for the rest of his life. He used to tell me that the ocean never cared how much money a man had, only whether he respected it enough to survive another tide. He worked these waters for almost 35 years until cancer finally caught up with him the spring before all this happened. The funeral flowers hadn't even finished drying when people around the marina started acting like his absence had left an empty seat for someone richer to claim. 3 slips away sat a floating mansion owned by a man named Graham Ashcroft. If you've ever met the kind of guy who introduces himself by his family name before his first name, you already know Graham. Perfect white smile, pressed linen shirts, expensive watches he somehow managed to wear on a dock without getting dirty, and enough money to convince half the harbor board that every opinion he had deserved applause. He had recently become chairman of the Marina Association after promising investors he'd transform our old fishing harbor into what he called a modern coastal lifestyle destination. Every time he said those words, I wanted to ask if he'd ever actually spoken to someone who made a living on the water. His vision included boutique cafes, luxury slips, polished boardwalks, and fewer commercial fishermen because apparently crab traps didn't photograph well for tourists. The first time we really spoke was about 2 weeks after Dad died. Graham walked onto my dock wearing loafers that cost more than my monthly fuel bill, looked around at my bait barrels and stacked wire traps, then smiled the kind of smile people wear when they're pretending to compliment you. "Ethan," he said, "you've inherited a wonderful location. Shame about the equipment." I asked him what that meant. He pointed toward my orange floats bobbing offshore and shrugged. "We're trying to create a cleaner image around here. Bright commercial gear isn't exactly helping property values." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Over the next month, little things kept happening. Somebody complained my ropes looked messy. Another board member suggested I paint my boat white because blue looked dated. Then there were anonymous notices tucked under my windshield asking me to keep bait buckets out of sight before tourists arrived. None of those things bothered me nearly as much as the way they talked about fishermen like we were leftovers from another century, instead of the people who built that harbor in the first place. My father had helped prepare those docks after winter storms. He'd volunteered during search and rescue operations. He'd taught kids how to tie knots every summer festival. Yet suddenly none of that mattered because wealthy homeowners wanted prettier photographs. Standing there that morning staring at the empty water where my gear should have been, I noticed the laminated card tucked beneath my windshield wiper. No signature. Just one sentence. Maybe it's time the harbor reflected its future instead of its past. I read it twice, then folded it carefully instead of throwing it away. Anger makes people reckless. My father taught me that evidence makes them nervous. I climbed aboard the Hazel May, started the engine, and idled out to where my first string of pots should have been. The GPS coordinates were perfect. The ocean was empty. Nearly $1,400 worth of traps rested somewhere on the bottom because someone wanted to erase a fisherman from the picture. But money wasn't what made my hands shake. One float had been carved from cedar by my dad 27 years earlier after I caught my very first crab. He burned our initials into the wood with an old soldering iron and told me, as long as this float stays on the water, people will know a Calloway worked this coast. That float was gone too, and in that moment I realized whoever had done this wasn't just trying to cost me money, they were trying to erase my father. I looked back toward the marina where Graham's 80-foot yacht gleamed under the morning sun, polished so perfectly it reflected the sky like a mirror. And for the first time since burying my dad, I felt something heavier than grief settle into my chest. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever decided my family's legacy was disposable had just made the biggest mistake of their life. I wish I could tell you I marched straight over to Graham's yacht and gave him the speech he'd been asking for, but that's not how my dad raised me. He always said that the loudest guy on the dock usually had the weakest case, so instead of chasing him, I spent the next 3 days chasing paper. While everyone expected me to lose my temper, I was digging through county records, faded survey maps, marina agreements that hadn't been opened in decades, and property files covered in enough dust to convince me nobody had cared about them since Ronald Reagan was president. The woman behind the records counter recognized my last name before I even introduced myself. She smiled, disappeared into the archive room, and came back carrying an old cardboard tube tied with brittle string. Your father used to come in every few years just to make sure these were still on file, she said. He always told me someday his son would need them. I laughed because it sounded like one of Dad's old superstitions, until I unrolled the survey across the table. My grandfather had helped build part of Stoneham Mill Harbor back when it was still mostly commercial fishing. Instead of leasing every piling from the marina, a handful of old families had actually purchased the underwater structures themselves before the association ever existed. Most people assumed the marina owned everything because that's how it looked from the surface. But legally, there was a difference between leasing water space and owning the timber pilings driven into the seabed. My family still owned 3 of them, including the one securing Graham Ashcroft's 80-foot yacht. I stared at that survey for a long time before looking back at the clerk. You're telling me he's been tied to my property? She adjusted her glasses, checked another file, then nodded. Looks like 8 months. Maybe longer. I felt my pulse slow down instead of speed up. That's the funny thing about real leverage. It doesn't make you angry. It makes you patient. I thanked her, made certified copies of every document, and drove straight to Portland to meet a maritime attorney named Rebecca Sloan. She listened without interrupting while I explained the missing traps, the anonymous notes, the pressure from the marina board, and finally the survey. She didn't react until I laid the deed in front of her. Then she leaned back, smiled once, and said, "Mr. Calloway, I think somebody got very comfortable assuming fishermen don't read property law." For the first time in weeks, I smiled too. Rebecca explained that proving Graham had ordered my lines cut would be difficult without direct evidence, but proving unauthorized use of privately owned marine infrastructure was another story entirely. If his yacht had occupied my piling without a valid agreement, there were remedies available that most wealthy boat owners prayed they'd never hear about. We weren't talking about revenge anymore. We were talking about contracts, invoices, liens, and federal maritime law. Document everything, she told me. Don't touch his boat. Don't threaten him. Let the paperwork do the talking. So that's exactly what I did. I borrowed underwater camera equipment from an old lobsterman named Hank, the same man who taught me how to splice rope when I was 12. He climbed onto my boat one morning, looked at the empty space where my floats used to be, and quietly said, "Your father would have hated what's happened to this harbor, but he'd love what you're about to do." We dropped the camera beside Graham's yacht and slowly circled the piling. There it was, thick mooring hardware wrapped around timber my family legally owned. Barnacles had grown over the mounting points. Marine growth doesn't happen overnight. It proved the yacht had been there for months. Hank whistled through his teeth. That's one expensive mistake. We photographed everything from every angle, recorded timestamps, GPS coordinates, tide conditions, and measurements. Rebecca wanted enough evidence that even the other side's lawyers would rather negotiate than argue. Meanwhile, the harbor gossip machine was working overtime. Some people whispered that I'd finally snapped after losing my dad. Others claimed I was secretly selling my slip because Graham planned to expand the luxury section. Nobody knew I was quietly building a file thick enough to stop that expansion before it ever started. A week later, I installed a heavy marine-grade locking collar around the access ring on my piling. It didn't damage anything. It didn't touch Graham's yacht. It simply secured my property the same way someone might lock the gate to their own driveway. Within an hour, I heard shouting from 3 slips away. Graham's captain was waving his arms while trying to adjust the mooring lines. The yacht had shifted only a few inches with the tide, but now every movement reminded them that their million-dollar toy depended on timber they didn't own. Graham stormed down the dock wearing sunglasses and that same expensive smile, although this one looked tighter than usual. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded. I shrugged. "Maintaining my property." He laughed. "Your property?" I handed him a certified copy of the deed. He barely glanced at it before folding it in half. "Cute trick." "It's not a trick. The marina owns these docks." "The docks?" "Yes," I answered. "Not every piling underneath them." He tossed the paper back at my chest. "You've been spending too much time talking to lawyers." I smiled. "Actually, not enough." He walked away shaking his head like I was some stubborn fisherman refusing to accept reality. But I noticed something important. He never denied using the piling. That afternoon, Rebecca filed formal notices documenting unauthorized occupation of privately owned marine infrastructure, along with a detailed invoice. We calculated fair market mooring fees dating back to the earliest confirmed occupation, added the documented loss of my commercial fishing gear, replacement costs for custom equipment, legal expenses, underwater inspection fees, and interest. The final number came just under $50,000. At the bottom sat one sentence that changed everything. "Payment required within 14 days or further maritime remedies will be pursued." Graham called me before sunset. "You actually expect me to pay this? I expect you to read it." He laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You commercial guys always think paperwork scares rich people." "No," I replied quietly. "I think paperwork scares people who ignored it." He hung up without another word. The next several days were strangely peaceful. I went back to fishing with borrowed gear, prepared traps for neighbors, drank coffee with Hank every morning, and pretended nothing unusual was happening while Rebecca continued filing additional notices behind the scenes. Then something unexpected happened. People around the harbor started talking, not about my missing crab pots anymore, about the deed. Old-timers remembered my grandfather helping install those pilings decades ago. Retired captains started digging through their own files wondering what rights their families had forgotten. Suddenly, Graham's shiny redevelopment project wasn't the only conversation in town. History had entered the room, and history had receipts. On the 7th morning after the invoice went out, I watched Graham's black SUV roll slowly into the marina parking lot instead of his usual sports car. No music blasting, no confident stride, just him carrying a leather folder under one arm while his attorney followed a few steps behind. They walked straight toward my boat where I was replacing hydraulic hose on the winch. Graham looked at the grease on my hands, then at the harbor around us, and finally spoke in a voice so calm it almost sounded unfamiliar. "Mr. Calloway, perhaps it's time we discuss a resolution." I wiped my hands on an old rag, glanced toward Rebecca as she stepped onto the dock carrying her own folder, then looked back at Graham. I've been ready to discuss one since the morning somebody decided my father's legacy was worth less than a fresh coat of paint. He didn't answer, because for the first time since we'd met, there wasn't a single clever thing left for him to say. Graham stood there, looking at Rebecca, then back at me, and for a moment the whole harbor went strangely quiet. Even the gulls seemed to disappear, leaving nothing but the slow slap of water against old timber. His attorney opened the leather folder, cleared his throat, and slid a draft agreement across the bait table on my boat. "Our client is prepared to settle this matter privately," he said. Rebecca didn't even touch the papers. "My client is prepared to listen," she replied, "assuming this isn't another attempt to pretend none of this happened." Graham exhaled through his nose. The kind of sigh people make when life finally reminds them money isn't the same thing as control. "Look," he said, "things got carried away." I actually laughed. Carried away? Somebody destroyed commercial fishing gear, tried to pressure me off property my family has owned for decades, and erased something my father carved with his own hands. That's your definition of carried away? He opened his mouth, closed it again, then stared out toward the harbor instead of at me. I realized right then that this wasn't the same man who'd walked around acting like the marina belonged to him. This was someone who had finally run into a problem he couldn't buy his way around. Rebecca finally opened the agreement and quietly shook her head. "Not even close," she slid it back. "You forgot the public apology, reimbursement of legal costs, future use agreement, governance protections, and compensation for the commercial losses." Graham frowned. "Those conditions are excessive." I leaned against my boat and folded my arms. "No. Cutting my father's lines because they didn't match your luxury image was excessive. Hank happened to be walking down the dock carrying a bucket of bait and stopped just far enough away to pretend he wasn't listening. Two charter captains slowed down without saying a word. A couple repairing nets nearby suddenly became very interested in tying the same knot for 10 straight minutes. Everyone knew something important was happening. Rebecca handed over our final proposal. Graham read each page slower than the last. The first section covered financial compensation. The second established a long-term licensed use agreement for the piling. The third permanently protected commercial fishing operations from aesthetic restrictions voted on by the Marina Association. The fourth created an annual scholarship for local fishermen's children, in memory of my father, Daniel Calloway, funded entirely by Graham's development company. The fifth required a written apology published in the Harbor newsletter and presented during the next public association meeting. Then he reached the last page. I watched his expression change. "You're asking for a permanent voting seat?" he asked quietly. Rebecca smiled. "Not asking, negotiating. My family's ownership rights gave us leverage no one had bothered to understand until now. If Graham wanted certainty for his investors, he needed certainty from me." Several long minutes passed before he finally uncapped his pen. "I still think you're making a mistake," he muttered. I looked him straight in the eye. "Maybe, but it'll be my mistake to make," he signed. His attorney signed. Rebecca signed. Then I signed last. Just like that, months of intimidation ended with 4 signatures and a handshake that neither one of us really wanted to give. The first payment arrived less than 2 weeks later. I didn't spend it on a new truck or a bigger boat. The first thing I bought was a local woodworker's time. I handed him an old photograph of the cedar float my dad had carved all those years ago, complete with our burned initials, and asked him to recreate it exactly the way it had looked before someone decided it didn't belong in their version of the harbor. When he finished, I mounted that float inside the hazel may above the wheelhouse window where I'd see it every morning before heading out with the tide. It wasn't the original. Nothing ever could be. But every time sunlight hit that cedar grain, it reminded me that memories don't disappear just because someone throws them overboard. Funny enough, the harbor began changing after that, just not the way Graham had planned. The scholarship helped 2 local kids attend a maritime training program during its first year. Younger fishermen stopped feeling like outsiders at association meetings because they finally had someone willing to speak up when policies ignored the people actually working on the water. Tourists still came, cafes still opened, and fancy boats still docked during the summer. But now they shared the marina with crab boats, lobster traps, weathered captains, and families whose roots stretched back generations. It turned out authenticity attracted people better than polished perfection ever could. As for Graham, I still see him sometimes. The hired captain is gone now. More often than not, he's the one washing his own yacht, polishing stainless railings under the afternoon sun while ordinary folks walk past without paying much attention. We don't wave much, but we don't argue either. Every once in a while, our eyes meet across the dock, and there's this quiet understanding neither of us would have believed possible a year earlier. He learned that influence built on image can disappear overnight. I learned that protecting your family's legacy doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just requires patience, paperwork, and refusing to let someone convince you your history is worth less than their future plans. My dad used to tell me that every piling driven into the ocean carried the weight of the people who put it there. Back then, I thought he was talking about wood and steel. Now I know he was talking about something else entirely. He was talking about respect. So here's what I'd love to know from all of you. If someone tried to erase something your parents or grandparents spent a lifetime building, would you have fought the way I did? Or would you have walked away and started over somewhere else? And be honest. Do you think Graham deserved a second chance after signing that agreement? Or do you believe some lines, once crossed, should never be forgiven? Share your thoughts down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life stories of justice, resilience, and unforgettable community conflicts, and I'll see you in the next one.